Tragedy has struck once again here in the United States, this time in the state of Indiana at a mall where a mass shooting took place, but this time a little bit of heroism was mixed in and possibly saved a lot of lives. Let's talk about it. So we're going to talk about the incident itself, how it started, how it was resolved. We're going to talk about policy, stats, and polling surrounding this whole situation. So stay tuned for that. So if you don't already know, there was a shooting at a mall this last weekend in Indiana. As you can see here from the New York Times, 4 dead in Indiana mall shooting, officials say. That's 4 people, including the shooter himself. This qualifies it as a mass shooting. And what we know so far is that the victims are 56-year-old Pedro Pineda, 37-year-old wife of Pedro Pineda, Rosa Miriam Rivera de Pineda, and 30-year-old Victor Gomez. And the suspect was a 20-year-old from the area by the name of Jonathan Douglas Sapirman. Now, the shooter was using a SIG M400 rifle. This is very similar to an AR-15 type rifle. It uses the 5.56 round. He also had a second rifle that he stored in the bathroom and was also carrying a handgun, a Glock 33. But what makes this case interesting, the silver lining in this story, is that moments after the shooter began shooting and going on his rampage, an armed citizen almost immediately responded and took out the shooter. As you can see here, Good Samaritan praised for actions in Greenwood Park Mall shooting. Police say the actions of a Bartholomew County man saved lives after a shooter opened fire in the Greenwood Park Mall Sunday evening. Around 6 p.m. Sunday, a lone suspect entered the food court of the Greenwood Park Mall. They then shot into the mall, killing 3 people and injuring 2 more. The shooter was shot and killed by a man visiting the mall. The Good Samaritan, as police called him, was armed with a handgun. And I'll let the police chief of Greenwood, Indiana, tell you his thoughts on the Good Samaritan.
But I'm going to tell you, the real hero of the day is the citizen that was lawfully carrying a firearm in that food court and was able to stop this shooter almost as soon as he began.
What can you tell us about him? I'm sure if you want to tell us his name, that'd be great. But I'm sure
I can tell you that he's a 22-year-old male from Bartholomew County, and that is all that I can release at this time.
So as you can see in the clip there from the police chief himself, he believes the Good Samaritan is the real hero in the situation. And we know now because the Good Samaritan authorized his name for release. But the good guy with a gun was a 22-year-old male by the name of Elijah Dickin from the town of Seymour, which is about 45 miles from Greenwood. I think too often in these cases, the good guys don't get the praise they deserve. So Elijah Dickin, we salute you. Praise be known. Now, I want to go back to the police chief because he goes over a bit of a timeline and what happened in this situation. So let's take a look at that.
The following is a timeline of events. We know that Mr. Sapperman, through surveillance video, entered the mall at entrance 4 by the food court at 4:54 p.m. He walks directly to the food court restroom. 1 hour and 2 minutes later, he exits the restroom and shoots Victor Gomez outside of the restroom. He then points his rifle into the food court where Pedro and Rosa Pineda were eating dinner and shot both Rosa and Pedro. He then fired several more rounds into the food court, striking a 22-year-old female who is currently recovering from a leg wound at Eskenazi Hospital, and a bullet fragment believed to have ricocheted off of a wall did strike a 12-year-old female who was running towards exit 4 in the back. That was a minor wound treated at the hospital. They did remove a small piece of metal jacket. Most likely at 5:57 p.m., the shooter was confronted by a Good Samaritan who are looking by just a minute. The Good Samaritan was armed with a pistol and engaged the shooter as he stood outside the restroom area firing into the food court. The shooter fired several rounds, striking the suspect. The suspect attempted to retreat back into the restroom and fell to the ground after being shot. We recovered 24 .223 rifle rounds shot by the suspect and 10 handgun rounds fired by the Good Samaritan.
So a couple of things to note there. You see they talk about the shooter going in at 4:54 p.m. into the bathroom and staying there for about an hour and 2 minutes, loading up and everything. Now, I could be reading a little too into this, but It appears he left the bathroom to begin the rampage at about 5:56 p.m. The type of round he was using, the type of firearm he was using, it was a 5.56 caliber, 5.56 NATO, the standard round for an AR M16 type rifle. Is that just a coincidence? That's just something I noticed. Maybe that played into it. I don't know. Maybe that's why he was taking so long in the bathroom, because he wanted to hit that specific time. I don't know, but I think it's a possibility. But notice how the chief said at 5:57 p.m., the Good Samaritan engaged with the shooter and stopped him. He shot 10 rounds at the guy and stopped him. Boom, it was over. You hear all the time people saying, oh, well, what are you going to do with a pistol against someone with a rifle? How are you going to stop them? Well, look what happened here. The suspect had a rifle. He was already shooting in a rampage. And then immediately, the Good Samaritan takes out his handgun, doesn't even have rounds fired at him. He's, pretty much scar-free from what I've heard in the reports, wasn't even hit at all. And 10 rounds at the suspect, dumped them. Contrast that with the response at Uvalde, where nearly 400 officers were in Uvalde at the school before the gunman was killed, according to a new report. Here you can see a picture where someone's stopping the officers, telling them, I guess, not to proceed, where they stood by for more than an hour while children were being killed, which ultimately left 21 people dead at the school. But in this case, you have a food court, tons of people at the mall. The suspect was able to get off about 20 shots before 10 shots were fired by the Good Samaritan and stop the threat. So 400 officers waiting more than an hour versus an armed citizen, 22 years old, who stopped the threat almost immediately. Now, I want to highlight a few things about this incident. And you're going to see the police chief say here that the Good Samaritan in this incident, who stopped the mass shooter, was not a licensed concealed carry permit holder.
Chief, can you tell us about the Good Samaritan, even though there's not a gun permit in Indiana, what was the status of his permit and his level of cooperation with your investigators?
We could not find that he had a permit. He was carrying legally under the constitutional carry law.
So you hear the reporter ask about the permit status of the Good Samaritan, and the police chief said he does not have a permit as far as they're aware, but that he was carrying lawfully according to constitutional carry. So constitutional carry in Indiana only passed recently and went into effect, get this, as you can see here from the indiana.gov website, on July 1st, 2022, the state of Indiana will no longer require a handgun permit to legally carry, conceal, or transport a handgun within the state. July 1st, 2022. That means less than 3 weeks ago in the state of Indiana, what this Good Samaritan did by carrying his firearm in that property was illegal. Had constitutional carry not passed and had this law not gone into effect the time that it did, potentially we could have had a lot more people dead at this mall. And I want to talk about this mall and the group that owns it in particular, because I've had a lot of experience at their properties, because it's always something that's bothered me, and it bothers me in this case as well, because as you can see here, Greenwood Park Mall had policy against weapons ahead of Sunday's shooting. The owners of a mall where a shooting took place Sunday had a policy in place making the location a, quote, gun-free zone. Last updated in April 2020, Simon Property Group states in its code of conduct that no weapons are allowed at their shopping centers. The group is the owner of the Greenwood Park Mall. And here you can see the Simon Properties Code of Conduct, where point number 3 is no weapons. But get this, a spokesperson with the mall issued a statement Monday morning. In part of the statement, they said they were grateful for the heroic actions of the Good Samaritan who stopped the suspect. Quote, "We grieve for the victims of yesterday's horrific tragedy in Greenwood. Violence has no place in this or any other community. We are grateful for the strong response of the first responders, including the heroic actions of the Good Samaritan who stopped the suspect." So they're grateful for the actions of the Good Samaritan, but the Good Samaritan was actually acting in defiance of their code of conduct policy. He was acting in defiance of the rules that they've set in place for their different properties. They have a no guns policy for all their different properties. I'm sure many of you have probably seen them, anything with like mills at the end of it. Simon Property Group, they own a ton of malls across the country and even in different parts of the world, and they ban guns. Now, luckily in the state of Indiana, these no gun policies, these no gun signs don't actually carry the force of law. So he was able to carry in there under constitutional carry without his permit. But that's not the case in all states. And of course, in the state of Indiana, if they warn you about you violating their rules when it comes to carrying a firearm on the property or whatever, they can trespass you, and then you'd be in violation of trespass. So what really bothers me is that properties like this can put no guns policies in place. They don't actually have to put any other things into effect when it comes to reasonable security measures or anything like that in order to protect their patrons, but they can put this no guns policy, and then they're not liable for the carnage that occurs when someone decides to violate that policy and bring in a firearm and commit a mass shooting. Personally, I think if a private business is going to remove your ability to defend yourself with a firearm, as you are legally allowed to do so, then they should assume liability for whatever happens when it comes to, potential self-defense situations, mass shootings, etc. Especially if they haven't taken the reasonable steps of proper armed security on the premises. And if you guys agree or disagree with that take, let me know in the comments down below. Now, as the common adage goes, when seconds count, police are just minutes away. A lot of people understand this sentiment, even if they don't know the exact line. And I think a lot of Americans basically understand this. They understand police can't be everywhere. They often get to the scene of the crime after the fact, and they usually can't stop things before they happen, at least in a direct way. Which is why I want to go to this polling survey that was conducted by Trafalgar Group recently. This happened in July, so this month. And if we scroll down, we can see they asked respondents, how confident are you that your local law enforcement and government officials could identify and stop a violent person before they started a mass shooting? 9.8% of respondents said very confident, 28.1% said somewhat confident, 35.3% said not very confident, and 26.9% said not confident at all. And you can see the breakdown of this by Democrat versus Republicans. Republicans seem to have a little bit more confidence in law enforcement and government officials than Democrats do in these types of instances. But here's where it gets interesting. When it comes to protection during mass shootings, the question is, what do you believe would best protect you and your family in the event of a mass shooting? 41.8% said armed citizens, 25.1% said local police, 10.3% said federal agents, and 22.8% said none of the above. And when you look at the breakdown for Democrats versus Republicans, Democrats, way fewer of them said armed citizens, only at 16.3%. The plurality seemed to say local police at 31.4%. Strangely enough, federal agents at 18.5%. I don't know where they get that. That's just a bizarre thing if you understand the number of federal agents, where they're concentrated, how they move about, etc., how they even respond to these types of things. And 33.9% said none of the above. When you go to Republicans, the vast majority said armed citizens at 70.4%, 16.8% said local police, 1.6% said federal agents. So it seems there's a better understanding of reality there when it comes to federal agents, at least. And 11.2% said none of the above. And when I looked at the crosstabs, I thought the racial breakdown of this was pretty interesting as well. So when it came to what do you believe would best protect you and your family in the event of a mass shooting, you could see 21.3% of Asians said local police, 33.8% of blacks said local police, 26.7% of Hispanics said local police, and 23.8% of whites said local police. When it came to federal agents, blacks at 16.9%, the highest of any group. When it came to armed citizens, you see Asians and whites both at 45.2%, with blacks at the lowest at 25.7%. So I just wanted to note that. I thought those numbers were kind of interesting. Also, this survey was conducted between July 7th and July 10th of this month. So obviously it happened after Uvalde, but before this Greenwood, Indiana shooting. I think it'd be fair to imagine that after this Greenwood, Indiana shooting, the confidence in armed citizens could be even higher than it was before. Now, I've already seen media outlets framing this in such a weird and dishonest way. For example, what you see from this BuzzFeed News article, 3 people are dead after a shooting at an Indiana mall food court. It comes just weeks after a state law that dropped gun permit requirements went into effect in Indiana, despite opposition from head of state police. Now, if you read that headline and subheadline, you'd think, oh, the reason that this shooter was able to go in and kill people is because of this new law, without acknowledging that it was legal to carry a rifle pre this constitutional carry anyway in the state of Indiana. By the way, not legal in Simon Properties or whatever, and also definitely not legal to kill people in a mass shooting like that. But also not recognizing in the headline or subheadline that the armed Good Samaritan wouldn't have been able to carry there had it not been for the constitutional carry law that passed, because he didn't have a permit. Just 3 weeks ago, what he was doing would be illegal. You see another headline like this from Newsweek: Indiana shootings come 2 weeks after permitless gun carry law introduced. I mean, it's just so bizarre. And I also want to talk about this for a moment because you always hear the media saying, oh, good guy with a gun. That's a myth. That's never happened. They've never stopped mass shootings. That's definitely not true, and I want to go over some of the numbers because the media will use one set of numbers when they actually really want to talk about the issue, and it's still not even super fair, but let's go over some of them. So the New York Times has an interesting breakdown where they say, who stops a bad guy with a gun? And they look at about 433 active shooting attacks that ended. The source for this, by the way, is the Alert Center. And here you can see 249 attacks ended before the police arrived. So the majority of attacks end before police arrive. And of that, 185, the attacker left the scene or died by suicide. In 64 of them, the attacker was either subdued without being shot by a gun. And in 22 incidents, the attacker was shot by either a citizen, security guard, or off-duty police officer. Now, I've seen many articles saying, well, it's much more likely for unarmed people to subdue an attacker than someone with a gun. Yeah, sure. But I would also say, look at the chances of someone being unarmed versus armed in a scenario like that, especially in states where it's illegal for the vast majority of the population to carry a firearm. You'll often have cases where nobody could possibly be carrying, legally at least, among the victims. So they would have to be unarmed. But I think it's fair to assume on a per capita basis, if you want to assume that unarmed people outnumber armed people who carry out in public at any given time by about 40 to 1, then per capita, it seems like armed citizens are a lot more successful than unarmed ones. But also here, the criteria by which they define an active shooting is a bit suspect. And I promise this is related, but when I posted this tweet saying, good guy with a gun stopped a mass shooting today, don't let them tell you otherwise, I got responses like this. Bad guy with a gun plus good guy with a gun equals 3 dead. Nice. Obviously being sarcastic. Cool, I'm sure the dead will really appreciate it. I mean, he still killed 3. Stopped, in quotes. So this is the thing. They won't count a lot of these armed citizens stopping people before a mass shooting happens because they're like, well, a mass shooting didn't even happen, so you don't actually know what would have happened had that armed person not shot the other guy and killed him, because you don't know if there would have been a mass shooting because one didn't happen. But then when one happens, even if it's on the lower end of like 3 people being killed and then 4 including the shooter or whatever, so just barely meeting the definition of what would constitute a mass public shooting or a public killing or active shooter, then people say, well, people still died. He didn't stop these people from dying. So you really can't make anyone happy here. You really can't, you can't say, well, there wasn't a mass shooting. Well, you don't know that there would have been a mass shooting had he not stopped the guy. Okay, there was a mass shooting. Well, he didn't stop the mass shooting from happening. You're never going to make anyone happy here, but I think we can generally recognize if someone goes out to commit a mass shooting and they're in the process of it, and someone stops them early on before those body counts really rack up and they really had the means to carry out more people dying, as was clearly the case in this scenario, given all the magazines that he had and tons of ammo that he had and the different rifles and handguns, etc., there was a lot of potential for additional carnage. And that was not the case because we had someone who stopped the guy almost immediately. But again, the way they define these active shooter incidents and things like that, or mass public killings, etc., it doesn't take into account all the different instances where an armed citizen potentially stopped a mass shooting in progress. I think an interesting list that actually keeps up with these types of things is from John Lott over at Crime Prevention Research, or crimeresearch.org, which you can see here, updated, compiling cases where concealed handgun permit holders have stopped likely mass public shootings. Now, I don't even like to call this concealed handgun permit holders list because, we have a lot of constitutional carry now. So I guess people lawfully carrying firearms, permitted or not, would be a better term to use. But you can go through this list, and this is a lot more than 22 instances. I mean, you can go through, I mean, even in the last few years, you see multiple instances. Some you might think are more legit than others based on the potential for it leading to a mass shooting or not. But you can just go through all the way, tons of cases. So whenever someone tells you armed citizens never prevent anything, when it comes to mass shootings, you can tell them that they're wrong. So while this is ultimately still a tragedy and people did lose their lives, the potential for the loss of more life was also there, but it was stopped by a good Samaritan, a good guy with a gun, who stepped up and was ultimately the hero in the situation. A 22-year-old by the name of Elijah Dickens saved the day. So a salute to Elijah. You did the right thing. You saved lives. Don't let anyone tell you that you're not a hero, because you are. And you know what? Let's try to do a positive thing here. Let's contact Simon Properties Group. I'm going to leave their phone number here if you want to call it and give them a piece of your mind. Tell them to get rid of their no weapons policy. Clearly, they can't protect people at their properties. They're not putting the proper armed security, armed guards there. They're not putting metal detectors or whatever. So if they're going to deprive you of your ability to defend yourself, they should at least have those in place. And if they're not going to have those in place, if they're not going to invest the dollars in proper armed security, well, they should at least respect our ability to exercise our rights to defend ourselves at their properties, where mass shooters apparently can walk in and stay in the bathroom for over an hour, loading up their rifles, getting ready to kill people. So give them a piece of your mind. Tell them to change the policy. Who knows? Maybe we can make a difference here. Anyways, guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Did you guys learn anything? Let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Social media links are in the description box below, as well as merch. Support us at nuancebro.com/join, and I'll see you next time, bro.